Good afternoon, good people of the world. Thank you for joining me for another round of the Tele. Today, we're talking about inflation, which I think has been top of mind for many people and is a pretty interesting topic. So we'll dive right into it. Love this quote. Inflation is what you pay $15 for, is when you pay $15 for the $10 haircut you used to get for $5 when you had hair. That's just perfectly sums it up. If I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you yet, my name is Craig Gingerich, a certified financial planner, certified 401k professional, accredited investment fiduciary, certified health savings advisor, and just certainly a personal finance nerd. So I have the pleasure of taking you through this tour of inflation today. So what we'll be talking about, a quick look at just what is inflation, talk about kind of the driving forces of what creates it within that. We'll talk about what has people concerned. Why does this matter or impact you at all? And then, as always, what can you do? How do we take that and focus on the things we can control and adjust accordingly? So start with what is inflation? It's the general increase in price or the gradual decline in purchasing power over time. So the perfect example that gets brought up all the time is stamps, right? People have to buy stamps. Back in 1990, you paid a quarter. Today, 58 cents per stamp. And it feels like a pretty dramatic growth when you think about it. It's like, oh my gosh, these things have been getting out of hand. I ran the quick numbers just to see. It's only about a 2.75% inflation rate on stamps over that time period. So as much as it feels like it's outrageous, it hasn't been as bad as some areas. So what causes inflation? What's driving that? And in its purest form, there's really two things that are creating inflation. The first is push inflation. So that's when things cost more, then it's kind of pushed down the line on each step of the process of creating a good or service. It's pushed down the line until eventually it lands in consumers' laps and they have to pay extra for something. The pull effect on inflation, on the other hand, is when there's demand-driven increase in prices. So when there's more buyers out there demanding more than what's readily available, and they're willing to pay extra for it, that will drive the price of something up. If there's 100 people trying to buy it and there's only 90 of that item, well, some people are probably going to be willing to pay extra for it so they can raise the price up. And that, over a broad scale, really pushes inflation. I mentioned the purest form because in the less pure form that we call real life, the government has a dramatic impact on inflation and intentionally does so. So while push and pull have an impact, it's not on such a grand scale that it can be that intentional. Government policy absolutely is directly impactful and intentional, and tends to come, there's more than just this, but in general, comes from controlling the release of money. So controlling how much is printed and pushed out there, how much is brought in and destroyed or recycled or whatever. Using government spending is one of their favorite ways to go about it. So if you're watching it live, certainly if the infrastructure bill goes through, that is a lot of government spending, which will create a lot of extra money that's out there and leads to some inflation. Setting borrowing rate is a big part of it. So the government's the largest borrower as well as the largest lender out there. So if the Federal Reserve sets a rate higher on interest rates for banks to borrow from them, and then eventually gets passed down to consumers, gets passed to businesses that are borrowing the money, need to pass that down to the next layer of consumers, drive some inflation. And then also one thing that kind of gets overlooked, which is really interesting, and to me, I lose interesting in a loose term, is that the federal government's the largest employer in the country as well. So when you think about driving wage inflation, they directly control wages of the largest body of employees out there. So they can say, well, if we're trying to increase inflation or increase wage inflation, we'll just raise what we're paying all of our employees, and that will then have an impact on the free market. If somebody's evaluating jobs and says, I can go work for the post office or I can go work for FedEx. Well, if the post office raises its price or raises its wages, that can directly impact what their competitors for labor have to pay their people, which is sort of an interesting way of looking at things. You don't often think about the government as an employer, much more in fiscal policy is how we think of government inflation. So let's give an example here. Let's apply it to life. So say that you are in the market for kitchen cabinets. You're redoing your kitchen, market for kitchen cabinets, and that has absolutely been experiencing inflation. The push effect, the cost effect, is that lumber prices have gone up. It was shortage of labor prices going up, gas prices going up, cost of lumber is going up. And so all of those costs then eventually have to be built into the cost of lumber, which is the supply for the people that create the cabinets, who then have to pass that down to you. So that's the push side of things. The pull side of things, the demand side of things, is that you are far from alone and being interested in doing home renovations right now, with people staying home more and spending less on travel. And the demand for renovations has dramatically increased. So if you are able to get to a contractor, they're charging more, right? If they have 1,000 potential customers, they can raise their prices and still have more than enough to keep them busy. So demand has then been driving inflation, specifically around kitchen cabinets. And then finally, the government's had an impact. The really easy example is just the influx of cash. So if you think about the stimulus checks, I recognize that they were absolutely needed for some people, right? There were people that were in need, and that kept them afloat and was important. It was also just an economic stimulant for others. And people said, oh, I got extra cash in the bank, time to do a home renovation, or time to get new furniture, time to do more spending. So that directly caused inflation. When you increase the supply of money, people are willing to give up more of it to get what they want. They've also set interest rates extremely low, which means that it's cheap to borrow money to do renovations. Going out and getting home equity line of credit is really cheap right now, which means maybe we should go do our house project this year. And if you kind of trace that back to the source of it, the Federal Reserve setting their monetary and borrowing policy has driven that. So sort of interesting. So what has people concerned, besides the fact that it's now more difficult to get kitchen cabinets or lumber? What's really got people concerned? And that is when you start comparing it to where we were to where we are today. So even in this short time frame of the graph that's on here, you can see we're going from the low 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 up to a 5.4% inflation rate as measured by the consumer price index. That's huge. That is a gigantic jump. And I realized that 5%, when you say 5%, oh, it doesn't feel that big as just a number in itself. But 5% as you multiply it across all of your expenses is absolutely gigantic. Where I find the scariest part of it is in terms of saving for retirement and funding your income, your spending in retirement. So we've been hovering in these really historically low interest rates, call it 1% and some change. Well, if you retired and you said, okay, I'm planning on just 1% inflation rate, for the cost of things to double, it'll take about 70 years. Or if you're thinking about, I have 10 grand in the bank, and I'm just going to keep it there as my emergency fund, in 20 years, how much will it buy me? And it loses its purchasing power only down to about 81, 8,200 bucks. Not that bad. If you look at a 2.5%, that drops you down to 29 years. So it drops it pretty dramatically. And that 10 grand that you're holding on to, after 20 years, it's only worth $6,000. How about 5%? 5% inflation gets scary fast. That means that if you're at 5% inflation rate and you're retired this year and you're planning on living a 30-year retirement, so you're 95, the cost of everything will be 4 times what it is on day one. Right? A 5% inflation rate means it's going to double in 15 years, over 15 years, and then going to double again over the next 15 years. It means after 20 years, your $10,000 that you thought was this nice cushion of, oh my gosh, if I needed to replace the roof, I have 10 grand, I can replace the roof, just transitioned into, oh my gosh, now I can maybe replace the water heater, right? It went from $10,000 of purchasing power to $3,500. that is terrifying. So really, really impactful as you start seeing it multiplied out there. I do want to caution people a little bit because it feels really intimidating when you start seeing some of those numbers. The reality is I don't think that it's nearly as bad as maybe the news is making it out to be. So a couple key considerations. First, demand-driven inflation tends to be temporary. So when you see kind of short-term spikes based off of demand, things like the Beanie Baby craze, you'll see that it spiked for a period of time and then it came back down. You recognize like, okay, maybe demand isn't going to stay outrageously high forever. The other piece of that is supply-driven inflation tends to lead to innovation. So when there's a shortage of supply and people say, I really want this, but there's just not enough out there for me to be able to buy it, you start seeing innovation in terms of people finding ways to create it. So if you think about like face masks, there was a huge shortage, right? Spike in demand, shortage in supply. Well, now fast forward the 18 months and it is easy to find masks everywhere. Right now, I think what we're experiencing is a shortage in supply of labor. It's just a guess, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw much more of this self-service kiosks. Hey, we couldn't find somebody to work the job. We've automated it, or we've outsourced it, or we found some way to work around it because the supply was just too low. And we can't deal with this inflation going, we can't pay people 30% more than what we were last year for the exact same job. We got to find a creative way to fight that inflation. And the last part of things is from a federal government level, they have a vested interest in trying to control and keep inflation down. When you think about it, the largest borrower in the world is the United States government. They have borrowed the most money out there. And while it's borrowed, they're having to pay interest, right? Having to pay interest on things. Well, if they let inflation grow and we start seeing interest rates grow with inflation, that means they have to spend more out of their pocket to service the debt they already have. They don't want to do that. They don't want to have to pay extra on all the outstanding debt that they have out there. If they can keep interest rates really low by controlling inflation, that means that they're having to pay less on the debt that they created. So they have absolutely a vested interest in trying to contain inflation a little bit. I don't think that it would be a problem if we saw things creep up to the 2.5, in the 2 to 3% inflation range is not the end of the world, but the rates we've been seeing, in my opinion, seem like they're a shorter duration than what some might believe. So as always, most importantly, this great chart from Carl Richards about the behavior gap, but talks about things that matter, things you control. That's what we're going to focus on. So what can you do if what I've shared is intimidating or scary, or you just want to know how to take that into your life? First, lock in low interest rates while they're low. So if you own a home, maybe it's the right time to be refinancing. If you're considering buying a car, maybe do it while interest rates are so low, whereas car prices are high. But just think about the things that you can lock in a low interest rate because rates are at all-time lows. Second, evaluate inflated purchases before you make them. Think about, is it a panic or is it actual inflation that's kicking in? If it's a panic, consider just biding your time or renting instead of buying something. If it's true inflation, or you say, okay, like this is sustainable for the foreseeable future, well, maybe now still is the right time to buy. Third, probably most important, put your money to work. If you're holding heavy on cash, you got a lot in the bank, or you're holding money markets, if you've been just sitting out there waiting for the right timing, what you're seeing is that at that 5.4% interest or inflation rate, your money's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, right? You're buying less every single year. And as the rate of inflation increases, you just sitting on cash is going to hurt you more. Investing into the stock market, in my opinion, is the best hedge to inflation. It continues to grow. You're investing into an appreciating asset that also often drives income, right? It's kind of the best of both worlds. On the other side, I inevitably hear, oh, I'm going to buy into gold because it's a hedge for inflation. It is somewhat, but it's not in my opinion, not the best hedge to inflation. What you're doing is you're buying a commodity, and yes, that helps preserve some of your buying power. So you're saying, instead of paper dollars, I'm owning this commodity that's typically retained its value. But retaining your value or growing your purchase versus growing your purchase power is not nearly as good, right? If I can say, okay, I take my gold brick down and it will always buy me the exact same level of car. Perfect. I've retained my purchasing power. If instead you're taking that money and dropping it in the stock market and it's outpacing inflation, plus it's paying me dividends, or I'm earning interest and just seeing the capital appreciation, well, that's better, right? It's a much better hedge to inflation. And you're buying into businesses that historically businesses have benefited from inflation. They pass the cost down, but they also pad their profits along the way. So to me, I want to be one of the people, I want to own a company that's going to benefit from inflation, not just hedge myself against it. So happy to take questions, but I'll finish as always with thank you. Thank you for your time this afternoon. If you're tuning in after the fact, thank you for taking time to listen to this. Happy to take any questions. Please feel free to reach out to me at cgingerich@sagerutty.com, or my direct phone number is right on there. But most importantly, thank you for the business and trust that you're placing with me and you're placing with all of Sage Rutty. We certainly do not take that lightly, and it's been a pleasure working with all of you.